After years of being criticized for my pointless career, Dad said, "From now on, you'll pay rent." So I packed and left. Days later, Mom texted, "Rent's due. Where are you?" I ignored it. You won't believe what they did next. Sup, Reddit. My parents trashed my career for years, so I moved out. Then they chased me for rent. When I didn't fold, they went nuclear. Here's how I handled it. Grab your popcorn and enjoy the show. I'm Drew, 28 male, and I've spent most of my adult life being treated like a defective piece of lumber by my own family. See, when you grow up in a household that lives and breathes custom carpentry, everything becomes about whether you can swing a hammer properly and follow in Daddy's footsteps without asking questions. My old man Bobby built his carpentry business back in the 90s, doing high-end kitchen cabinets and custom furniture for rich folks around town. The guy acts like he personally invented the concept of measuring twice and cutting once. He's got this way of looking at you when you mention anything outside his wheelhouse, like you just told him you want to make a living juggling for rent money. My mother Celeste is the queen of passive-aggressive garbage. She's perfected this art of sighing dramatically while wringing her hands during family arguments, making these wounded bird noises like she's personally suffering through everyone else's problems. Then there's my younger brother Mason, the golden child. He joined the family carpentry business right out of high school because thinking for yourself apparently wasn't part of his programming. Bobby treats him like he invented the concept of wood grain, constantly praising his natural instincts and dedication to the craft. Me? I've been working with metal since I was 17. Started in my buddy's garage welding exhaust pipes for gas money, then moved on to custom railings, decorative metalwork, and eventually full fabrication projects for local businesses. I built my skills slowly, invested in proper equipment, and built a lane for myself where I actually make solid money, creating everything from custom steel staircases to industrial shelving systems. But according to Bobby, metalwork is cold and soulless compared to the warmth and character of wood. Never mind that my custom steel and aluminum projects require just as much skill, precision, and artistry as anything he builds. Sunday dinner equals mind games with gravy. Bobby would sit at the head of the table carving meat like he was planning my execution, making these little comments about real trades and when you're ready to do serious work. Celeste would pile food on everyone's plates while shooting me these martyred looks like I was personally responsible for ruining the family legacy. And Mason? He'd just sit there basking in the praise while occasionally throwing in some supportive jabs about my hobby phase. I lived in this converted garage apartment behind their house, basically a studio space with a small living area that they'd fixed up when I graduated trade school. It was temporary, which in their world means until you give up and join us. But getting established in their language meant abandoning everything I'd worked for. The thing is, I wasn't struggling financially. I had steady clients, repeat customers, decent income from everything from custom gates to commercial fabrication projects. I was covering my truck payment, equipment costs, material expenses, and putting money aside. The only thing I wasn't covering was rent, because they insisted it was family helping family while I found my footing. What they really meant was, we'll support you as long as you eventually admit we were right and you were wrong about this metal nonsense. Every project I completed, every satisfied customer, every check I deposited, all of it got dismissed as getting lucky or playing around with scraps. Bobby had this way of acknowledging my income while simultaneously dismissing it as unsustainable. This had been boiling for months. Little digs at dinner about real trades, sideways remarks about when I was going to grow up and do serious work, questions about my long-term plans that really meant, when are you joining our business? I'd learned to just nod and let it wash over me because arguing with Bobby was pointless and messy. I kept thinking if I just stayed quiet, worked hard, and proved myself gradually, they'd eventually see that metalwork was a legitimate trade. Looking back, that was probably the most naive garbage I've ever believed, because the real issue was never about craftsmanship or success, or even money. It was about control. The garage apartment was perfect for them, close enough to keep me under their thumb, dependent enough to yank the leash, and separate enough to cut me off whenever they wanted to make a point. I just didn't realize how quickly that point was about to be made. The night everything changed started like every other Sunday dinner from hell. Bobby was in his usual spot at the head of the table, sawing through his steak. Celeste was doing her martyr routine, making sure everyone had enough food while sighing about how difficult everything had become lately. Mason was scrolling through his phone. I was just trying to eat my food and get back to my shop without triggering World War III. I had a big project due Monday morning, a custom steel and aluminum reception desk for a law firm downtown. But the old man had this radar for when I was mentally checked out of family time. "So, Drew," he said, not looking up from his plate, "any real work lined up this week? Or just more playing around with scrap metal?" "Here we go." "It's not scrap metal," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm finishing a commercial project. Custom reception desk, built-in cable management, powder-coated finish. The client's paying me $4,000 for 2 weeks' work." Bobby snorted. $4,000 for what amounts to bending some metal bars. You know what real money looks like? Repeat customers. Referrals. Building something that lasts generations. You're just making fancy junk that'll be replaced in 5 years. Mason jumped in, because apparently watching me get roasted wasn't entertaining enough for him. Dad's right. Anyone can weld some metal together. But real woodworking? That takes actual skill. He said it with this smug little grin that made me want to punch him. That's when Bobby leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and delivered the line that changed everything. He had the same expression he used to get when he was about to ground me as a teenager, except now I was 28 and supposedly an adult. "All right, from now on, you'll cover your own rent," he said, like he was discussing the weather. "No more freebies. You want to play metalworker? Then act like a real businessman. Rent's due at the end of the week." The room went quiet. Celeste shifted in her seat, looked everywhere except at me. Mason stopped chewing, probably realizing this was bigger than his usual entertainment. I just sat there for a second. This wasn't about rent money. I probably made more in a week than Mason made in a month. This was about breaking me down until I gave up and joined their little woodchip empire. Here's the thing about moments like this. You've got two choices. Either argue and feed the fire, or say okay and move in silence. I chose option 2. "Okay," I said, and went back to eating my dinner. That was it. Just okay. I could see Bobby was thrown by how easy it was. He'd probably been gearing up for a fight, ready to lecture me about responsibility and growing up. But I just finished my meal, helped clear the table like always, and excused myself. "Have a good night," I said, and walked back to my apartment like nothing had changed. But inside my head, everything was spinning. I wasn't angry exactly. I was just done. Done trying to win approval from people who'd already decided I was worthless. Done explaining myself to someone who'd made up his mind about me years ago. I sat in my workshop that night, surrounded by half-finished projects and the smell of metal and welding gas, and really thought about what had just happened. Bobby had basically given me an ultimatum. Fall in line or get cut off. He probably figured a week of panic about rent money would bring me crawling back, ready to trade my plasma cutter for a circular saw and a lecture about honest work. What he didn't realize was that he'd just freed me from the last thing keeping me tied to their dysfunction. By the time I finished cleaning my equipment that night, I'd made my decision. I was just going to leave. Quietly, completely, and permanently. I started packing the next morning while the house was quiet. Everything important to me fit in my truck and a small trailer I borrowed from my buddy Alan. The whole process felt like shedding skin. Every box I packed was a distance between me and their endless disappointment. By the time Bobby was getting ready for work, I was gone. No note, no goodbye, no forwarding address. I just locked the garage apartment and drove away from the only home I'd ever known. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. I found a small industrial space across town, a 1,200 square foot unit with good ventilation, decent power, and space for my equipment. The landlord, Hector, was this guy who cared more about on-time payments than family drama. That was a relief. For the first week, I just focused on setting up my shop and catching up on client work. Having my own space, with my own rules, was incredible. No more tiptoeing around Bobby's workshop schedule. No more listening to Mason's snide comments about real craftsmanship. Just me, my equipment, and the sound of work. My productivity went through the roof. It was like I'd been trying to work with someone constantly criticizing my technique, and suddenly there was silence. I didn't reach out to them. They didn't reach out to me. For about 10 days, I actually started thinking maybe this was it. Maybe they'd just write me off as the family disappointment and move on with their lives. Bobby could have his perfect little carpentry dynasty with Mason, Celeste could stop pretending to be caught in the middle, and I could build my business without their constant undermining. I should have known better. People like Bobby don't just let go of control. The text came on a Wednesday morning while I was cutting steel plate for a custom staircase project. Simple message from Celeste. "The rent is due. Where are you?" I stared at that text for a solid minute, actually laughing. Not because it was funny, but because of the sheer balls it took to send that message. Where was I? The better question was, where the hell had they been when I was growing up and actually needed parents instead of critics? But that text told me everything I needed to know about how they viewed the situation. In their minds, I hadn't moved out. I had just temporarily wandered off like a dog that would eventually come home when it got hungry enough. So I didn't respond. I set the phone down and went back to work. But the messages kept coming throughout the day. First, "Did you forget what day it is?" Then, "Your father is expecting you to handle your responsibilities." And finally, "We can't carry dead weight anymore. Time to step up." That last one made me pause. Step up. There was that same phrase they'd been using to manipulate me since I was in high school. When I didn't want to work weekends in Bobby's shop. Step up, son. When I chose metalworking classes instead of advanced woodworking. Step up. And when I told them I was starting my own business. Step up and stop being selfish. I let their messages sit unanswered for a couple more days, hoping they'd get the hint. But Bobby and Celeste don't do hints. They do escalation. That Saturday afternoon, my phone rang. "Mason, where the heck are you?" "No hello, no how's business going?" "I'm working," I said, keeping my voice flat. "You're supposed to pay rent." Dad's ticked off, and frankly, so am I. You can't just disappear and expect everyone else to cover for your nonsense. "I don't live there anymore," I said. "I moved out. I have my own shop now." There was a pause, and then his laugh. That condescending little chuckle he'd perfected over the years. "You think you can just walk away? This family doesn't work that way, Drew. You don't get to just bail when things get tough." "Tough for who, Mason?" I said. "You're living rent-free in the main house. You're being handed a business that's already successful. Bobby praises you every chance he gets. Don't tell me you're the one struggling here." "That's not the point," he snapped. "You think you're so much better than us with your fancy projects? You're still part of this family, whether you like it or not. Dad says if you don't get your act together, don't bother coming back." I hung up without another word. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down. Not from fear, but from pure rage. The absolute nerve of these people. They'd spent years making it clear I didn't measure up, and now that I'd finally accepted that and removed myself from their lives, they were acting like I was the one causing problems. The messages kept coming throughout the week. Celeste laying on the guilt. Your brother is working extra hours while you run away. Is that fair to him? Bobby, if you can't handle adult responsibilities, don't expect to be treated like an adult. And then the one that really got under my skin. If you're not paying rent, we'll have to cover it ourselves. Don't forget, that's money we've invested in you for years. You owe us. You owe us. It had all been a loan with interest, and now they wanted to collect with my obedience. That's when I started to wonder if they actually knew I'd moved out, or if this was just their way of yanking me back into line. Maybe they thought I was hiding somewhere in town, waiting for them to forgive me. But then Bobby showed up at my shop, and I got my answer. Thursday evening, I'm in my shop welding supports for a custom gate when I hear heavy footsteps outside. When I looked through the window, my stomach dropped. Bobby was standing in my parking area, arms crossed, wearing his work clothes and that expression that used to terrify me as a kid. I turned off my welder and stepped outside, keeping the doorway between us. No way was I letting him into my workspace. Drew, he said, voice low and controlled. We need to talk. About what? I said, though I already knew. You know darn well what. The rent situation. The disrespect you've shown your family. This little tantrum of yours ends now. I don't live there anymore, I said, keeping my voice steady. I moved out. I have my own place now. That should be exactly what you wanted. Me standing on my own. He shook his head like I just said something stupid. That apartment was provided for you as family support. You don't get to just walk away from family obligations without consequences. Your mother and I aren't going to subsidize your little rebellion. Something inside me snapped, like a cable under tension finally reaching its breaking point. Maybe you shouldn't have treated family support like a leash, I said. His eyes narrowed, and for a second I thought he might actually take a swing at me. Watch your mouth, Drew. You've been ungrateful long enough. This little stunt, running off, ignoring your responsibilities. It stops now. He stepped closer. For a moment I thought he might try to force his way into my shop, but he stopped just short of the threshold. We stared each other down in the doorway, both waiting for the other to make the first move. The air between us was thick with nearly 3 decades of unspoken resentment. I don't know what game you think you're playing, Bobby said finally, his tone sharp and clipped. But you don't just get to disappear and dump the consequences on your family. That apartment comes with responsibilities, and you're going to honor them whether you like it or not. I folded my arms, mirroring his stance. I didn't dump anything on anyone. I moved out and started paying my own way. Isn't that what you always said you wanted? You don't get it. His voice rose slightly, hand cutting through the air. This isn't about independence. It's about respect, about honoring your commitments to this family. That apartment wasn't charity. It was an investment. And investments come with expectations. That word stuck in my mind like a splinter. There had never been any investment in me as a person, only in me as a potential asset for their plans. I never asked for that apartment, I said, quieter now, but no less firm. You put me there. You said it was to help me get started. Now that I have gotten started, you're acting like I owe you for the privilege. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to that dangerous tone. You do owe us. Every meal, every ride, every dime we've spent trying to set you straight. You think any of this came free? We invested in you, Drew. All you've done is throw it back in our faces. Behind him, I noticed movement in a car parked across the street. Celeste's silhouette, sitting far enough away not to be obvious, but close enough to watch. She was probably taking notes for later. Why are you really here? I asked. His face hardened. Because if you think you can just walk away from your obligations, you're dead wrong. That rent is due, and you're going to pay it, one way or another. The way he said, one way or another, made it clear this wasn't a request. I thought about all the times as a kid when he'd used his size and voice to win arguments, filling up every corner of the room until there was no space for disagreement. How I'd learned to nod and agree, to make myself smaller, because fighting back just made everything worse. But I wasn't 12 anymore. I'm not paying rent for a place I don't live, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. And you don't get to show up at my business and threaten me. That's not how this works anymore. He studied me for a long moment. The silence stretched between us. Finally, he stepped back, adjusting his jacket, but his eyes didn't soften. All right, you'll regret this, he said, voice flat and cold. You'll find out real quick that you can't make it without family support. And when you come crawling back, don't expect us to be waiting with open arms. With that, he turned and walked back to where Celeste was waiting in the car. He didn't look back, but I knew this wasn't over. When I went back inside my shop, my hands were shaking slightly. I'd stood up to him, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like I'd just declared war on those people. And I was right to be worried, because what came next was worse than anything I could have imagined. For the next few days, I waited for the other shoe to drop. The messages started again, but this time they were different. More manipulative, more desperate. Celeste was handling the psychological warfare now, probably because Bobby had realized his direct approach backfired. Your father is devastated. Please just pay the rent and come home where you belong. Don't abandon your family over pride, Drew. We raised you better than this. Think about your brother. This is putting so much stress on him. Why make things harder for Mason? When I didn't respond to those, she escalated. 2 days later, I found an envelope slipped under my shop door when I arrived for work. My stomach sank when I saw the familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter written in Celeste's careful script, but the words were pure Bobby. Drew, this is your final warning. If you continue to ignore your family obligations, we will be forced to take action. You are part of this family whether you accept it or not, and that comes with responsibilities you cannot simply abandon. Consider this your last chance to do the right thing before we're forced to pursue other options. Other options. They were already planning. I found out what those options were when my phone rang during lunch. Hector, my landlord. Drew, I wanted to give you a heads up about something, he said, sounding confused and annoyed. Your father stopped by this morning, said he was here on your behalf, asking questions about your lease, your payment history, whether you'd been having any problems. I didn't give him any information, of course, but I thought you should know. My blood went cold. He was trying to interfere with my business relationships. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was him actively trying to sabotage my livelihood. But that was just the beginning. It got worse. Over the next week, I started getting strange calls. Potential clients who'd seemed interested suddenly canceling consultations. A supplier questioning my creditworthiness for no apparent reason. Small things, but they added up to a pattern. Then Alan, my buddy who'd helped me move, called with some disturbing news. Hey man, weird question, but has your family been asking around about you? Because my cousin works at the bank, and she said some older guy came in asking about your business account. Claimed to be your father, said he was worried about your financial situation. That's when I realized my father wasn't just trying to control me anymore. He was actively trying to destroy what I'd built. The next incident was the final straw. I was working late on a custom railing project when I heard vehicles outside. When I looked out, there were two trucks in my parking area. Bobby's work truck and Mason's pickup. They weren't just visiting. Mason was taking pictures of my shop, my equipment, even my customers' materials. Bobby was writing notes on a clipboard, like he was conducting some kind of inspection. I walked outside and the look on Bobby's face was pure satisfaction, like he'd been waiting for this moment. What the heck are you doing? I asked. Documenting safety violations, Bobby said calmly. You're running a business out of an industrial space that may not be properly zoned for metalworking. Someone should probably report that to the city. Mason smirked, still taking pictures. Also looks like you might not have proper permits for some of this equipment. That plasma cutter looks pretty industrial for this area. My hands clenched into fists. Now they were threatening to use code enforcement and zoning regulations to shut down my business. Not because I was actually violating anything. I'd checked all that before I signed the lease. Get off my property, I said, my voice deadly quiet. Now. Bobby stepped closer, that satisfied smile never leaving his face. This is what happens when you try to bite the hand that fed you, son. You're not as independent as you think you are. Predictable. I'd challenged his authority publicly, proven I could succeed without him, and now he was going to make sure I paid for that humiliation. But he had made one crucial mistake. He'd escalated from family drama to criminal harassment, and unlike family dynamics, the law was pretty clear about this kind of behavior. So I pulled out my phone and started recording. I'm asking you one more time to leave my property, I said clearly, making sure the camera caught their faces. You're trespassing and interfering with my business. His smile faltered when he saw the camera. Mason stopped taking pictures, suddenly looking less confident. You can't threaten us, Bobby said, but his voice had lost some of its authority. Put the dang phone down. I'm not threatening anyone, I replied, still recording. I'm documenting harassment and trespassing. Keep it up, and this video goes straight to the police. They left, but not before Bobby made one final threat. This isn't over, Drew. You have no idea what you've started. He was right about one thing. It wasn't over. But what he didn't realize was that I'd just gained the upper hand, because everything they did from this point forward was going to be documented, recorded, and used against them. He wanted to play hardball? Fine. But he'd picked a fight with someone who had everything to protect. After their little trespassing stunt, I knew I needed to get serious about protecting myself. They weren't mad. They were trying to tank my shop. I called my buddy Diego, who'd been running his own auto shop for about 10 years. He dealt with family drama that turned ugly when he left his father's garage. Dude, you need to document everything, Diego told me over coffee that weekend. Every text, every phone call, every time they show up at your place. And you need security cameras yesterday. Trust me, these family business feuds can get really nasty, really fast. He was right. I spent the next day installing cameras around my shop, front entrance, parking area, equipment storage. I was going to have evidence of every move they made. The cameras turned out to be a good move. 2 days later, the cameras caught Mason driving slowly past my shop during business hours, taking pictures with his phone. The next morning, I got a call from a potential client saying they'd heard concerning things about my business practices and wanted to cancel their consultation. When I pressed for details, they mentioned someone had called claiming to be a former customer with complaints about my work quality and professionalism. The description they gave matched Bobby perfectly. That afternoon, the city code enforcement office called. Mr. Drew, we've received a complaint about your business operation. Someone reported potential zoning violations and unpermitted equipment. We'll need to schedule an inspection. I wasn't worried about the inspection. Everything was properly permitted and zoned. But I knew the real goal was to waste my time, cost me money, and make me look unprofessional to clients. While I was dealing with city bureaucrats, my father was getting bolder. My cameras caught him and Mason conducting what looked like surveillance of my shop, sitting in the parking lot across the street for hours at a time. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. The breaking point came when I arrived at work one morning to find my shop's front window covered in spray paint. Someone had written "scam artist" and "cheats customers" in red paint across the glass. The cameras had caught everything. Bobby's truck pulling up at 2 a.m., Mason getting out with a can of spray paint, the whole vandalism incident in perfect detail. That's when I called Detective Maria Cruz, who Diego had recommended. She specialized in business-related harassment cases. "This has escalated beyond family drama," Detective Cruz said, after reviewing my evidence. "It's harassment and vandalism. We can get you protection." She walked me through the process of filing complaints and applying for protective orders. The paperwork was extensive, but every incident I documented, every threatening message, every act of sabotage was building an unshakable legal case. Meanwhile, my business was suffering. The constant harassment was taking time away from client work. Potential customers were being scared off by Bobby's campaign of lies. I was spending money on lawyers instead of new equipment, but I also started getting unexpected support. Word had gotten around town about what was happening, and other small business owners began reaching out. Alan introduced me to Dylan Rangel, who ran a successful electrical contracting business. "The thing about family business tyrants," Dylan told me, "is they can't stand seeing someone succeed outside their control. It threatens everything they believe about themselves." The guy became an unofficial mentor, giving me advice on growing my business despite the family drama. He even started referring clients to me, helping offset some of the damage Bobby's sabotage campaign was causing. But things were still getting uglier. The final straw came when I discovered he'd been contacting my suppliers, spreading lies about my financial stability, and trying to get my credit accounts frozen. One of my steel suppliers called to warn me, "Drew, someone claiming to be your father called saying you were having financial problems and might not be able to pay your bills. I know you've always been good for payment, but I thought you should know someone's trying to damage your reputation." That's when I realized Bobby's endgame. If he couldn't control me, he was going to make sure I failed completely. The next morning, I filed for emergency restraining orders against both Bobby and Mason. Detective Cruz had helped me prepare a comprehensive case file documenting months of escalating harassment, stalking, vandalism, and business interference. The court date was set for the following week. Bobby and Mason would be served with papers, ordering them to stay away from me, my business, and anyone associated with my work. But Bobby had one final card to play, and it was worse than anything I'd imagined. 2 days before the court hearing, I arrived at my shop to find the front door ajar. Someone had broken in during the night, but this wasn't a typical burglary. Nothing was stolen, but my equipment had been sabotaged. Welding cables cut, computer files deleted, project materials contaminated with metal shavings. The security cameras had been spray painted over, but not before catching a glimpse of Mason's truck in the parking lot around midnight. This was my father's final message, which was a big mistake. It was making things worse for them, because I had enough evidence to put them both behind bars. The family war was over. Now it was time for consequences. The morning of the restraining order hearing, I showed up with a tabbed binder. Detective Cruz had helped me organize everything: photographs, video footage, documented phone calls, witness statements, financial records showing the damage to my business. Every piece of evidence told the same story: a systematic campaign of harassment designed to destroy my livelihood. Bobby and Mason showed up with their own lawyer, some expensive suit who probably specialized in making rich guys' problems disappear. But you can't lawyer your way out of video evidence and police reports. The hearing was one-sided. Their lawyer tried spinning it as a family dispute gone wrong, claiming Bobby was just a concerned parent worried about my financial stability. The judge took one look at the security footage of Mason spray painting my shop window and Bobby conducting surveillance of my business, and that narrative died faster than a mosquito in a bug zapper. When she saw the police report documenting the break-in and equipment sabotage, it was game over. Bobby's face went white as paper. Mason looked like he was about to throw up. Their fancy lawyer was scribbling notes like his career depended on it. The judge barred any contact, kept them 500 feet from my home and shop, banned client-supplier reach-outs or any online mention of me, and said any slip equals immediate arrest. But here's the best part: she also ordered them to pay full restitution for my damaged equipment and lost business income. Nearly 15 grand total, plus my legal fees. Beautiful. Bobby looked like someone had just told him his precious workshop burned down. Mason actually did look sick at that point. The fallout was swift and brutal. Word spread through town faster than gossip at a church potluck. The story of the family carpentry business that tried to destroy their own son's metalworking shop didn't paint them in a sympathetic light. Their longtime clients started asking uncomfortable questions about doing business with people who'd resort to criminal harassment and vandalism. Within 2 weeks, they'd lost 3 major commercial accounts. One was a high-end kitchen remodeling contract worth about $40,000. Another was ongoing work with a local property management company that represented steady income for the better part of a decade. Mason got arrested exactly 12 days after the restraining order was issued. The idiot drove past my shop during business hours, thinking he was too smart. My security cameras caught everything, and I had Detective Cruz on speed dial. He spent 3 days in county lockup and got another 30 days added to his sentence for contempt of court. Meanwhile, Celeste was working overtime trying to salvage their reputation. She reached out through every mutual connection we had: old neighbors, distant relatives, people from church, anyone who might convince me to work things out and drop the legal proceedings. The woman had balls, I'll give her that. But there was no working things out. They'd crossed every line and burned every bridge. Bobby held out longer than Mason, but eventually took a plea deal on the felony charges, rather than risk a trial where all their dirty laundry would become public record. Smart move, considering the mountain of evidence against him. And me? While their world was crumbling, mine was taking off like a rocket. The whole situation had generated local publicity. Dylan Rangel started actively referring clients my way, telling them I was the guy who wouldn't be pushed around and delivered quality work no matter what. Diego spread the word in the automotive community that I was the metalworker to call for custom fabrication projects. But the real game changer? A reporter interviewed me in my shop, showing off a custom steel staircase I'd built for a local architect and a set of decorative railings that were headed to a luxury home development. Since then, my phone rang constantly with new project inquiries. I had to hire a part-time assistant just to handle scheduling and client communications because I couldn't keep up while actually doing the work. 6 months later, I moved to a larger facility with better equipment and more space. The new shop was 3,000 square feet in a light industrial complex, with overhead cranes, better ventilation, and room for the CNC plasma cutter I'd been saving up for. The monthly rent was triple what I'd been paying, but I was pulling in enough work to justify it easily. I also hired Brian, a young guy fresh out of trade school who reminded me a lot of myself at that age. Having an assistant meant I could take on bigger projects and actually focus on the complex fabrication work instead of constantly answering phones and chasing invoices. Bobby and Mason's carpentry business, meanwhile, was circling the drain. Their reputation was completely damaged by then. Mason was working alone most days, trying to handle projects that really required 2 people. Bobby's legal troubles and the financial hit from restitution payments had forced them to turn down several major jobs because they couldn't afford the upfront material costs. I heard through Alan that Celeste was pressuring Bobby to sell the business and retire early. The stress of everything was taking a visible toll. Bobby had aged about 10 years in the past 6 months, and Mason looked like he was hungover from the pressure of trying to keep the business afloat. Their workshop, which used to employ 4 guys during busy seasons, was down to just Bobby and Mason working on projects that barely covered their overhead costs. The irony was delicious. They'd spent years telling me I'd never amount to anything, and now I was out-earning their entire operation while working half the hours. But the most satisfying part wasn't watching their business struggle. It was the simple fact that I'd proven every single thing they'd said about me was complete garbage. They'd claimed I couldn't succeed without their support, that I'd never amount to anything outside their little kingdom. Instead, I'd built something bigger, more profitable, and more respected than anything they'd ever achieved. I never spoke to them again, never wanted to. The restraining orders were still in effect, and I had zero intention of lifting them. As far as I was concerned, Bobby, Celeste, and Mason had died the day they decided to try destroying my business rather than just leaving me alone. The best revenge, folks? Burn bridges when necessary and move on. Life is good.